want to speak to the population health discourse that is currently very important in Duke Health. And yet we also have many faculty colleagues at other medical humanities, health humanities related entities such as the Trent Center for Bioethics, Humanities, and History of Medicine on campus. And so we constantly find ourselves learning more about medical education, the interests of the residents in the humanities, about different faculty at the medical center who have done PhDs or masters in the humanities as well as medical degrees. We're seeing an explosion of courses on health humanities topics on campus. We know that undergrads are quite deeply invested in health humanities as a way to make meaningful connections between their different pre-health, global health, or just generally sort of parent-pleasing undergraduate trajectories and their true interest in storytelling and narrative and the arts, in history, and in all of the things that they need to have long and productive lives as intellectuals. So we think that this event is just going to be an amazing way to look at the evolution and change in the health humanities and in the complexity of who our audiences are, how we can reach them most effectively, most enduringly, most cost-effectively also. So we are grateful to the Franklin Humanities Institute and to the Publishing Humanities Initiative at FHI, and also to the Mellon Humanities Futures Grant, which funds our Global Health Humanities Working Group, which is also a sponsor of these events. And so we're thrilled to welcome our distinguished guests, editors of anthologies, volumes, series, and our scholars, movers and shakers. And we'll be thinking about when anthologies are used to create new touchstones of knowledge and community among scholars who will then develop a more institutional echo of their scholarship at their institutions, the curricular programs, sometimes the majors, the minors, the certificates. And for that, there seems to be nothing more useful than finding the right kind of volume that will actually speak to undergraduates and help faculty to organize their own new courses. So whether these volumes are canon setters or undoers of canons, whether they're scholarly conversations among pathbreakers in the field, or a dialogue between scholars and educational or public communities, they are a fascinating record, transcript of the current moment in American academia. So welcome, and we will be moving on to the introduction of Craig Klugman's keynote. And
Sylvia.
And Sylvia. Yes, and Sylvia's remarks.
Before
Yes.
we get to the main event.
That's right. And
do we want to also introduce ourselves too? Maybe after?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe go around the room and do that? Yeah, sure.
Okay. But,
okay.
So, anyhow.
Thank you, Deborah.
It's great to see you all here this afternoon. I'm just going to say a few words about the Publishing Humanities Initiative that Deborah mentioned. And then I'm actually going to invite all of our presenters to collaborate on a publishing project. Sponsored by the Generous Humanities Futures Grant from the Mellon Foundation, this conference is a collaboration in the usual way that these things are sort of like a web of connections. The Health Humanities Lab, as Deborah said, and the Franklin Humanities Institute's Publishing Humanities Initiative, which explores the fundamental value and meaning of publishing, defined broadly, and aims to offer inspiration, practical knowledge, and advice and support for all of the exciting, multifaceted, and multimodal projects that faculty and students are doing here at Duke. The initiative is sponsored by the Office of the Provost, the FHI, the Dean of the Humanities, and the Duke Library. So I always say thank you to all of them, but today I would especially like to also express my gratitude to Deborah, co-director of the Health Humanities Lab, whose visionary advocacy and support during her time as director of the Franklin Humanities Institute actually brought the Publishing Humanities Initiative into existence. Our next event, maybe more for local folks, will be on Wednesday, April 4th at the Franklin Humanities Institute. That is the one over in Smith Warehouse on South Buchanan. It's a talk by Roger Molina, a physicist at the University of Texas, Dallas, about his work connecting the arts and sciences via innovative publishing ventures called Leonardo and Arteca with MIT Press. And I don't know a whole lot more about them, but I can't wait to find out from him. I've really enjoyed working with the lab on the program for this conference. The mix of expert scholars in the field and editors with varied experience in publishing is, as a group of presenters, is quite unique, or at least quite unusual, I think. Just what I hope, the kind of thing that I hope the Publishing Humanities Initiative will do. Olivia was just asking me kind of like, how did we come up with this group of editors? So I'll just say a couple of words about that. First of all, you'll see we have editors who are actually the editor for the particular author who's speaking. So we have a few of those. And then we've added a couple of people who are also available locally who can give us yet another perspective. As I've talked to, well, look back on my experience at Scribner's and various imprints of Macmillan and Routledge and UNC Press, and then talk to other presses, I've found that the approach to publishing books for course use is actually quite different, like maybe even more different than I had expected. So we have Chuck Grench here from UNC Press, and we also have Robert Miller from Oxford, who isn't actually the editor of the Oxford book on the agenda, but he's spent his entire career publishing textbooks and also works at home in Chapel Hill. So we're also married, just to get that out of the way. Yes, it's true. I think I worked at UNC Press for at least a year before I figured out that the editor-in-chief and the managing editor were married. How was I going to know? But nobody told me. Anyway, okay. So I look forward to this exchange about how publishing can support the development of an emerging field, and expect it to be truly fascinating, and I also hope it will be useful. Which leads me to my last point about our publishing project. All the conference speakers are invited to collaborate on a paper. And other participants or people who attend, if you are interested in having input on this too, let me know. This is a paper to come out of the conference. Collaborative authorship, of course, is quite unusual in humanities. That will be one innovative thing about it. And Carrie has asked me to call upon my writing and especially editorial experience to lead and coordinate as needed. So following the last panel tomorrow, we'll have a chance to talk much more about it. So for now, please consider yourselves invited. And while we participate in the events this afternoon and tomorrow, keep the idea in the back of your mind. And tomorrow we'll talk about what we've learned from all the talks and discussions that we'd like to share, some kind of through lines or threads that we think would be important to bring out, who our audience, who we want our primary audience to be, and that will help us know actually what kind of article or paper we're writing and where we would like to think about having it published. So I look forward to that discussion and to working with you. Now I'm delighted to turn it over to Carrie, who will actually introduce the main event.
So let me just take a few moments to introduce our speaker who's going to kick off the workshop for us, Craig Klugman. And as he just mentioned, he's currently a professor at DePaul University, which is in Chicago, in the Department of Health Sciences. At DePaul, he also serves other roles. He's co-director of the Bioethics and Society minor. And he's also involved with the Digital Humanities Lab, so I want to hear more about that because I don't know anything about that. As a professional in the bioethics community in Chicago, he serves on the ethics committee at Northwestern Memorial Hospital there, and then more broadly in our professional organizations related to health humanities and bioethics. He's co-chair of the Health Humanities Consortium, and they're sponsoring the meeting in a month at Stanford. So I know there's a few of us who are going. You can learn more about it from Craig. He's also involved in other professional organizations, especially the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities. He serves on one of the affinity groups there. Craig's education started out with a Bachelor's of Arts in Human Biology at Stanford, and then went on not to do anything small. He took 2 MAs at Case Western, one with Atwood Gaines in medical anthropology, and the other with Tom Murray in biomedical ethics. And then he concluded his training with a PhD in medical humanities. And I think, is there only 3 places you can do that in the US? So an actual doctorate in medical humanities at the University of Texas Medical Branch. And there he wrote on, he did an analysis of death memoirs, and he was supervised by Harold Vanderpool. His own writing as a professional is broad as well as deep. And he's the author of over, 400 articles, blogs, op-eds, a variety of different ways to sort of get the message out about his interests, but the way that, including comics. I am an avid reader of his column in bioethics.net, where he does ethics on TV column, and he keeps me up to date on Grey's Anatomy and all the ethics issues. So if you need a quick primer on the ethical issues in Grey's Anatomy and other sort of TV shows, Craig's column is fantastic for that. More recently and more relevant, very relevant to our work today and tomorrow, editor and co-editor of several books. With Aaron right next to him, they just landed a contract with Oxford University Press, can I say it? Research Methods in Health Humanities, so we're really excited about that, and that complements the book that's just about to come out with Olivia Banner with Oxford also on teaching health humanities. So we've got some real experts about teaching and research methods in health humanities with us today. Craig also published a few years ago a textbook on medical ethics, and his first book, I think, maybe Ethical Issues in Rural Health, came out in hardback, and then several years later also in softback with Hopkins Press. He's also a filmmaker and a producer of an award-winning film. I want to just promote that. It's called Advanced Directives. Came out in 2012, a 16 or 17-minute film. It has won some awards. It's a great teaching tool around advanced directives, so I encourage you, streaming for free on YouTube. So advanced directives. And just to sort of round it all out with the fact that even if you know Craig, you didn't know, he's also an improvisational actor. I didn't know that. I've never seen him perform, so maybe there'll be an opportunity in the next day or two to do some improvisation led by Craig. Maybe that would be, we'll just sort of throw that out and see what happens. But anyway, Craig, thanks so much for opening up this conference for us. You're most welcome. Thank you.
So this is title slide A, and this is title slide B. So if you want to know what things look like in emojis, this is it. And this will make a lot more sense as I continue talking. But essentially, you can see health, humanities, past, present, future. Right? Duke actually has its own emoji, which is kind of cool. And then this is my little emoji. So yeah, keep this in mind. All right. So if you're looking for a definition of the health humanities, which is something we're all struggling with, the one that I've come up with is an interdisciplinary field concerned with understanding the human condition of health and illness in order to create knowledgeable and sensitive healthcare providers, patient, and family caregivers. As a field, the health humanities draws on the methodologies of the humanities, fine arts, and social sciences to provide insight, understanding, and meaning to people facing illness, including professional care providers, lay care providers, patients, policymakers, and others concerned with the suffering of humans. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today has come out of my conversations with Erin Lamb. First, we were thinking about undergraduate health humanities education, which she's going to talk a lot more about, for a special issue that was in December of the Journal of Medical Humanities, and second on the book we just contracted with. Where we see the health humanities as being, and the work needs to be done when we were putting the book together, coalesced around three ideas. One is, we need to define this new field. What are its boundaries and its borders, and how does it relate to the medical humanities and bioethics? Secondly, what is it that the health humanities does uniquely? Not necessarily borrowing, but adapting and growing, as we say in the improv world, yes-anding. And third, developing a consensus on what is a health humanities curriculum, especially for undergraduates. There are lots and lots of courses out there called Intro to Health Humanities, and most of them are very different. So what is it that we would have in common if we're saying that this is a field? So we'll start, like all good people in the humanities, at the very beginning with this text right here, bizarrely enough. And this, to me, is the earliest medical humanities publication. We're in the past, so we're in medical humanities here. And this is a tablet of Gilgamesh. In fact, it's the Death of Enkidu tablet, which talks about this day on which Enkidu dreamed came to an end, and he lay stricken with sickness. One whole day he lay on his bed, and his suffering increased. He said to Gilgamesh, the friend on whose account he had left the wilderness, once I ran for you, the water of life, and now I have nothing. A second day he lay in bed, and Gilgamesh washed over him, but the sickness increased. A third day he lay on his bed. He called out to Gilgamesh, rousing him up, but now he was weak, and his eyes were blind with weeping. 10 days he lay, and his suffering increased. 11, 12 days he lay on his bed of pain. Then he called to Gilgamesh, my friend, the great goddess cursed me, and I must die in shame. I shall not die like a man fallen in battle. I feared to fail, but happy is the man who falls in the battle, for I must die in shame. He touched his heart, but it did not beat, nor did he lift his eyes again. When Gilgamesh touched his heart, it did not beat. So Gilgamesh laid a veil, as one veils the bride, over his friend. This dates to about 2000 BCE. And so it's a 4,000-year-old story that was written, well, chiseled down, as an oral tale. So we don't even know how much older it is than this. And the act of writing changed narrative forever. Because oral stories were dynamic, they were versatile, they changed by the teller and by the audience. But when you write it down, it no longer does that. It is the same. And it could now be viewed asynchronously, whereas a story was a performance that you had to hear. It wasn't like you had a DVR and you could watch it later. But now you could watch it at any time by yourself with different people. And you also lost the personal embellishments of the storyteller. If we're looking at sort of a health humanities history, we'll jump forward 4,000 years here. And in 1925, Abraham Flexner, this is many years after his famous Flexner report that changed medical education. And he wrote a letter in 1925 that said, what have I wrought? He assumed that when people went to medical school, they would have a traditional liberal arts education. But what happened as a result of the report is that they now had a very science-based education, and the liberal arts were crowded out, the sort of thing we still see today. And so he thought it was a shame that people were going to medical school without having a liberal arts tradition first. In 1937, Vanderbilt actually called for technical training with a liberal education. And the first medical humanities course we see is 1952 at Case Western. The first person to ever use the term medical humanities is George Sarton, and in this publication here, you see it and blown up, This is actually the first time medical humanities ever appears in print. And this is a bibliography in ISIS, the publication of the History of Science Society. And it's supposed to be a bibliography, and it's kind of, this particular entry is also a in memoriam piece. You know, it is clear that the author, trained a physician, had a strong historical and philological instinct. His death at the early age of 48 is a sad blow to the medical humanities. It was just a phrase he tossed aside, and yet here we are, 70 years later, still using it. In 1967, Penn State and Hershey started the first humanities department at a medical school. A few years after that, we had the Society for Health and Human Values. 1979, we get the Journal of Medical Humanities. 82, we get the Journal of Literature and Medicine. In 1990, Hiram launched its Center for Literature and Medicine, which was the first undergraduate program. In 98, we had the ASBH, which of course subsumed the SHV, as well as 2 other organizations. And then in 2015, most recently, we founded in the United States the Health Humanities Consortium. And I point out to the United States because this has now become an international movement. And if you'd like to see a full timeline, you can actually go to the healthhumanitiesconsortium.com under About, and you'll have the full piece there. So let's jump forward to the present. And so you'll see I've represented the presence here with Gutenberg's printing press. So we're no longer sitting over our clay tablets chiseling things out, but we now have the ability to make many copies and to spread them out to many places. So among the things that's happening at this moment in time is we're moving from the medical humanities to the health humanities. This piece by Tess Jones, Michael Blackie, Rebecca Garden, and Delise Ware really said, you know, we have to move out of this notion of medical humanities because so much of the work is no longer in medicine and in medical schools, but people are interested in nursing programs and PT programs and undergraduate programs. And so we have to think broader. Plus, we've sort of been looking at these issues in terms of patients and physicians when we have now a whole bunch of, there are more lay care providers than there are professional care providers. And there are, you know, the one thing, even if you're never working as a care provider, professional care provider, you will someday be a patient. You will someday take care of, have a family member who is a patient. And we all struggle with these same very concepts. So the idea of health humanities is broader, more inclusive, and more multidisciplinary. It's also sort of a switch from thinking about the application. So within the medical school, the humanities have often been of instrumental value. So you can, you know, study literature so you can understand compassion or empathy. You can look at a piece of art to gain observation skills so you can see your patients better. And I'm totally guilty of doing this. But the idea now is that maybe there's something else that we are that is intrinsic value, instead of just being a handmaiden to medicine, as was said at one time of nursing. And so, you know, we also have here the special issue of the JMH on the future of pre-health education being in the humanities. There is a big change going on in pre-health education. And Erin Lamb and Olivia Banner will discuss this much more tomorrow. But in general, as you can see here, the number of increasing programs at the baccalaureate level is huge. Since I think in the last 15 years, we've gone from having like 4 programs to close to 80 now. And Erin will give us the very specific numbers tomorrow. At the same time, we now have 13 master's degrees in health humanities and starting to see some PhD programs developing, 1 or 2 out there on the horizon. At the same time, so I have a piece in the Journal of Medical Humanities. It's available pre-press right now. It's coming out this year, where I looked at, I surveyed every MD and DO school in North America, so US and Canada, and including Puerto Rico, and looked at what do they teach in medical humanities, what sort of disciplines are involved, how much time do they have, what courses are offered, what years do they offer these sorts of things. And what I found was that whereas the medical humanities were a proud tradition in many med schools, what you have is 4 medical schools that have 100 hours plus that they offer to their students. And then everybody else is much smaller. The median is 29 hours. So that shows you how things are skewed. You take those 4 programs out and everything drops to, about 10 to 20 hours over 4 years. So we've got fewer schools that are now offering these, and it's funny, so the AAMC asks this question every year. 96% of schools say, of course we have it. And when you say, okay, what do you offer in the humanities? Suddenly, many fewer actually have something going on. There are fewer hours. The trending is down in terms of being part of the curriculum and having expansiveness in the curriculum. While electives are still offered for the most part as standalone courses, none of the required humanities curriculum is really offered that much as a standalone. We have been part of the integration movement, which is essentially mean we've been combined with ethics, bioethics, and then we're sort of pushed out of the way because bioethics becomes the whole curriculum. So the integration of medicine has been detrimental to the humanities in most medical schools at this point. So there'll be more on it when that comes out. What we have now is a whole bunch of books coming out, which is exciting, or have coming out. There's sort of this little burgeoning renaissance happening. We had the Health Humanities Reader and Medical Humanities Introduction that sort of started things in the US. In the UK, Medicine, Health, and the Arts came out with Routledge Press, and this sort of started the conversation happening in Europe. And now we've got so much else coming on, and and Carrie and Esther and Allie and Matthew are all going to be talking about the different books that are coming out in their work, which is really exciting. Upcoming we've got the teaching in health humanities, and we've got our book and the research methods. So there's a lot of people coming together and thinking about these issues and these topics at this moment in time. We have professional organizations developing. The ASBH is 20 years old this year, which is very exciting. I remember the very first meeting in Houston when I was a grad student. This is the Health Humanities Consortium right here, the big circle and a square with triangles that we have been around since 2015 now. The International Health Humanities Network started in 2014. This is in the UK's organization that really started things, and the first meeting of the Health Humanities Consortium in the US was also an international meeting of the UK group. And this year, actually the very end of 2017, thinking in academic years, this academic year, Canada sort of announced their first group, the Canadian Association for Health and Humanities. So the health humanities are organizing on a professional level, which is very exciting. So that leaves us to the future, which is a crystal ball in emoji terms. And the comic is very representative of some of the things I want to talk about here. So this was for an article on the use of telemedicine, that your doctor would be through your phone, and they would send drones to send you whatever medical tests were needed, and you would take your own samples and send it off on the drone, and then the drone would come back. This is really being proposed, by the way, with whatever medications you needed. And so they were working on, so how do you deal with empathy? How do you deal with the human connection? And so my joke with the comic here was, well, we could just have an empathy protocol. So that's where it came out, in a very questioning cat. Okay, so traditionally, we have thought about the humanities in medicine as very instrumentally, right? So we're teaching, as I said, we teach specific skills, whether that be communication, empathy, observation, listening, to help understand the patient's perspective and to help patients and families understand and cope with illness. I sort of feel like with all of these trends happening towards professional organizations, towards having our own core literature, towards developing our own bachelor's programs and certificates and majors and minors and master's programs, that perhaps we are moving towards disciplinarity. This is happening in bioethics. There was an article that came out about 2 years ago saying, it's the moment for bioethics to be a discipline. But I actually think, sort of sneaking behind the sidelines, we're moving in front of them in doing this. We're developing our own research. So one of the things, we put out a call for papers for this book, and we had 45 responses. And it wasn't people who say, okay, well, I'm a literary scholar and I apply my work to medical texts. It was, I was a literary scholar, but I borrowed this piece from anthropology, and I borrowed this piece from disability studies, and I've kind of created this new thing. We have almost 45 examples of that, unfortunately, because books can't be 1,000 pages long anymore. We're only getting a subset of that. So it seems like we are developing our own very unique methods for doing our work. We are doing health humanities research rather than medical humanities research or bioethics research or literature research. And we're sort of teaching that there is an inherent value to the humanities, that studying them is not good because it'll make you a better care provider, but because it'll make you a better person. And so, and a big part of this movement is also, and the reason that the Health Humanities Consortium was created is because we feel like the poor stepchild of bioethics. That when ASBH was born, it was very exciting. And in fact, I was at a session on research ethics yesterday for the ORI, and the research ethics people were complaining that they're really not part of ASBH either, but that ASBH is really the clinical people and the doctors, and they've really taken it over. So about 4 years ago, the humanities people said, you know, well, we're just going to have our own meeting, and that led to, well, we're having so much fun, we're just going to have our own organization to serve our needs, because we don't feel that we're getting the place and the space in ASBH. So I think those are things that are happening. All right, so what about publishing the health humanities? Yeah, there's all these books coming out. But are we facing the end of print? So I am the blog editor at bioethics.net, which also means I'm one of the editors for the American Journal of Bioethics, because bioethics.net is their online portal. And one of the things that we have been in negotiation with our press, who is not represented here, is that their view is traditional journals have about 5 years left. Traditional print journals are going to either transform, to our press's view, to online or something different. And we're actually being very experimental to try and figure out what that something different is. So when Erin and I were shopping our proposed volume, we went to an unnamed publisher who is very large and very well known, and they said they were really interested in this. But their comment was, would you be open to a PDF-only version? And I guess being sort of old school scholars, we had an emotional reaction of no. Like it's not real if you can't hold it in your hands. But given the size of the volume we were asking for, they felt it would be too expensive to print on paper. We wanted a print book. We're traditional, which is a nice way of saying old at this point. My last book, which just came out 2 years ago, was a textbook on medical ethics, and it is $200 a copy. It is too expensive for most places to use. The only way that I even let my students use it, and I wrote it for my students, was that the publisher agreed that if your college library buys an electronic version, that all the students can then access it for free. So it's on electronic reserves, and I tell all my students, do not buy this book. So, and at first I didn't know that, so I felt very conflicted about having my students use the book that I wrote for them. But then when I found out after talking to the publisher, I felt more comfortable using it. So although we love the feel of the text in our hand, and the smell of the pages, and the flipping thing, I mean, I haven't bought a physical book in years that wasn't an academic book, because I carry my Kindle, and I have 1,000 books in just a few ounces. So the sense of holding that weight of the literal weight of the words in our hand, it seems to be moving away. The future of publishing is electronic. At the same time, there's some weird things happening. Sale of e-readers dropped 20% in 2016 and have continued to drop since, and only 19% of people own one. But the sales of ebooks have increased. So if you are a manufacturer of these devices, you don't like this because you want to sell new devices, but the technology hasn't changed very much. But we're buying more books on these, and the books that are selling the most most books are now sold we sell more electronic versions of books than print books. And the print books that we are selling are coloring books, are interactive books that you couldn't, and if I colored my Kindle, it's one page and then I'm stuck with it forever. So it's sort of interesting trends. You can see the ebooks are going up very much here. This is the Kindle Oasis, which is a very, very overpriced, but I have it and I absolutely love it. All right, so what else is changing in our publishing world? Preprint servers. Anybody ever hear of a preprint server? Okay. So this is really big in science and chemistry, and it's starting to be adopted in biology. We haven't done it in the humanities yet, but I think there's some really interesting aspects to it. This, in a way, it also means the end of traditional peer review. So in a preprint server, you upload a final draft of your article. You haven't sent it out for a journal or for publication yet. You upload it to a server. So there's RXI, there's Bio, RXIV, and people can read your article and comment on it. So instead of having 2 or 3 peer reviewers, you might have 100 or 1,000. And then you can take their feedback and actually change the document, and the changes happen on the server. And so you're kind of getting this constant feedback. It creates a community around your work. Everybody sees, now you know who your authors are, you know who your reviewers are and your commenters, and you can make edits. And so instead of being on print, remember when I said we went from oral speaking to being on those tablets, cuneiform tablets, well, now we're going back to a more dynamic sense of writing and narrative because we can change things on the fly as we get feedback. So this is sort of in the sciences, growing and growing. We had a blog that was written on bioethics not very recently by someone suggesting that this sort of thing, putting your paper up here, should not prevent you from being able to apply for a journal and get your document in there, that this should not count as first publication because this is now part of the process of writing in a lot of the sciences. So it's something we could think about for the humanities that might be really interesting and dynamic. The peer review is a 17th century creation. And there is a lot of questioning, this was on NPR, over whether it's really serving us well. For example, we last week were reviewing abstracts for the ASBH meeting in Anaheim. We're actually at the Disneyland Hotel in October. And the first review I pulled up was for a workshop that had a citation from me on it. And so I said, okay, there might be a conflict here. It cites me. And they said, well, is it criticizing you or just using you as a fact? I said, it appears to be just a fact. They said, well, then there's no conflict. So, okay. So there's something that this sort of idea isn't exactly working, that we're so interrelated now in the work that we do, people are calling for a new model. And so the preprint server is sort of the response that's being come around for that. We also have, because publishing's become expensive, the rise of independent and open access publishing. The cost of traditional journals goes up by 6% per year. And 3/4 of all libraries over the last several years have had flat budgets. So if your university library has a flat budget, but the cost of your journals is going up every year, the only response is you can only purchase fewer journals. To deal with increasing costs, you reduce the number of titles. Or if you want to keep the same number of journals, you have to get fewer books or shorter hours. You have to make it up somewhere. As scholars, we provide the content for free, and then we pay to get access to our own work. It's a strange system. We sign over the rights to the contents of our production. So, there are very few journals that will let you not sign over the copyright to them, or book publishers. This was something we came over when we were looking at the contracts for our book, for the book Erin and I are doing. And one of them let us keep the copyright, the others did not. And when we sort of asked about this, the explanation we got from the journal, from the one who gave it to us, was that that was a European convention. But another European publisher told us that if they keep the copyright, then they will defend it. So if somebody violates it, they will go after them. If we have the copyright, then we are responsible for hiring lawyers and going after it and actually, making sure that we are protected. So that seemed like more work than we wanted to deal with. We also have a situation there. Publishing a book can take 1 to 4 years. My first volume on rural health, we had a symposium much like this. Everybody presented papers. They were then invited to turn them into chapters for the book, and they got edited, and we shopped and found a press, and then they edited, and there was a peer review. And it was 4 years after our initial meeting until it came out. In self-publishing, it's instantaneous. It costs nothing. For that first book, I paid $1,000 out of my own pocket. I was a second-year faculty member who was making very, very little money in Reno, Nevada. And I had to pay $1,000. That was my limit I could afford to have a proofreader, just to make sure it was clean copy, because the press didn't do that. So if I do Amazon self-publishing, I can not only get royalties out of it, I keep the copyright, and I don't have to pay anybody. And if there's a mistake I found later on, I can correct it. And if you've got the Kindle version, it all gets updated automatically. So when you think about the cost, so the JAMA journals alone, it cost my university library $8,200. We're not a medical school. We don't have a medical school. And it still costs $8,200 for us to have access to that. If you are a medical school, your price is $27,000 a year, just because you have a medical school. And you can go online to their subscription site and see for if you offer a PhD, you get this. If you don't, you have that. And to buy a single academic article costs $39 for a single article. Now, my university does not subscribe to the drama. Well, they've dropped the JAMA journals. So anytime I want, it costs me or my library $39. So publishing has gotten so expensive, and libraries just can't afford to have a lot of journals of their own. So there's a big increase now to use more open works. In fact, we have an entire task force on my campus trying to encourage people to use open source books. Right after I published mine, so I wasn't excited about it. The blog. This is probably the area I know the most about. And recently, this was in January, I published my 300th blog over 5 years. So that comes out to like 350,000 words. And so my dog interviewed me for this. And the fun comic. But there are medical and humanities blogs. This is an art note. So one of the things that we're doing to sort of experiment what is the future of journal publishing is we're working with a program at University of Illinois Chicago that trains people in medical illustration, and they are now producing the covers of our journals. The covers are way cooler now, and they're much more popular. And then we allow the artists, who are the students in this program, to put an artist note that we put onto the blog. Right? So now we're bringing the arts really into what is a traditional bioethics journal. And then Ars Medica is another one. So there's a lot of variety of ways of coming around this. So blogs are this new, exciting area. The American Society of Sociologists has actually put out a report saying that blogs should count for tenure and promotion. And social media and op-eds, because this is sort of where the emphasis is going in a lot of ways. So not only have I written all these blogs, it's an average of 65 a year, but I also train people. So we have people who want to write. Anybody who wants to write from a blog, please talk to me. We need new people. But I will help train people on how to do this, and they go on and do it very successfully. We started the AJOB blog, the bioethics.net, in the early 2000s. It was then discontinued for stories that make really great gossip. But we brought it back about 5 years ago. For every piece on here, we have 2,500 readers. And 14,000 people at least receive the title and a short description of it. The average academic article has less than 10 readers. And here, for a blog, a 1,000-word blog that takes me about an hour and a half to put together, I get 2,500 readers. We also post all of the editorials from the journal on the blog now, and now we are going to start printing some of the blogs as editorials in the journal. So they're feeding each other. What's cool about blogs is the timeliness. Something happens, you write it, and it's out there within a few hours. You made a mistake, you change it. It is a living document, so you can constantly be changing and altering it. It creates conversations. People use these in classrooms. People cite these. I have seen blogs cited in books, scholarly books, which shocked me to no end. We don't use references. We use hyperlinks. So if you find something and there's a citation for it, you don't have to then go find it. You click the link and it takes you right there. So there's a dynamicism, a living sense to the document. You have a larger readership, but it's also much more public, which is positive and negative. It's also really experimental. If you've got an idea and you can get 1,000 words on it, you can throw it out there. And maybe you don't have any data, maybe you haven't developed it fully, but you can sort of throw it out there, claim that space, or see what sort of conversation occurs, and then you can go on and write a larger article, or maybe you move on to something else. Maybe you're done. So blogs have been a really interesting thing. There's a bigger question though. So the New York Times last month had this series on the post-text future. Now that second slide of mine makes sense, right? With all the emojis. And the question is this the end of text? As one of the writers for that series says, I'll make this short. The thing you're doing now, reading prose on a screen, is going out of fashion. The Chicago Humanities Foundation for this year put out this quote: "Our world has become increasingly visual in a way that is fundamentally changing how we experience, engage, and even think about the world." So it's not just the New York Times. This is appearing in many different ways in our society. All right, so here's some really disturbing facts for humanities scholars. Last year, 25% of US adults did not read a book. The idea that the New York Times is picking up on here is that all the great innovations we're seeing now are in cameras, speakers, microphones, screens, technology that are all pushing us toward a non-text future. Instead, what we have are memes, GIFs, audios, tweets. Some publishers are thinking in this direction. So at A-Job, not only are we having these sort of medical illustration covers, we're doing comics. So this was one on the quantified relationship we had a whole series on. Basically, you can use apps on your phone to measure who's a better partner in your relationship. I'm not doing it, but it's out there. We are also looking at filming short videos so that the authors will have their regular article, but then they'll have a short video talking about their work, what it was about. So for people who don't want to sit there and do reading. Authors are kind of resistant to do this, so because it's a lot of extra unpaid work again, but we're seeing the writing on the wall that the future is not writing, that journals are too expensive, that libraries are carrying fewer of them. In fact, we just got reclassified from social science to medical journal and went from being in 2,000 libraries to 500 because they repackaged us, right? And it takes too long. Things happening so fast today that it takes too long to wait for something to get into print. That article on the MDDO thing, it's going to be a year from time, over a year from time of submission till it's printed. So the publishers are probably not going to push our discipline to move in this direction. We've been pushing the publisher in a way to see these things in a conversation, in a dialogue. These changes are coming, whether we want them or not. And so as Health Humanities, we have to decide if we want to be part of this, we want to be in the forefront, or we just kind of want to be left behind. Now you might be a little skeptical, you're like, it's just one New York Times piece. But let's consider this. Social media, Twitter, our country is being governed right now in 240 characters, right? Instagram is not words. Instagram is images. If you are under 30 years of age, you do not use Facebook. I'm sorry, if you're under 25, you don't use Facebook. It's too text heavy, right? You use Snapchat because it's all images. the reason that we've gone to comics, putting comics on the blog, is because in social media, images capture people's attention, words don't. So even in the social media sphere, it is moving towards, in the younger generations, it's moving towards images and away from text. Audiobooks. Michio Kaku, the physicist, in The Future of Humanity, Terraforming Mars, Interstellar Travel, Immortality, and Our Destiny Beyond Earth, that is the title, was interviewed on NPR a few weeks ago. And he said that we are close to being able to download memories so that instead of reading a book on Winston Churchill, you will go to your library and you will interact with a virtual Winston Churchill. So you don't need to read about it. Now you can just ask questions of the actual person. Audiobooks are outstripping print publication or even ebook downloads. In 2017 alone, there was a 34% increase in the number of audiobooks being read. And 48% of the listeners of audiobooks are under age 35. This is the future. We're listening to words. We're not necessarily reading them anymore. What about podcasts? 70 million Americans, 40% of the US population listens to podcasts. In the medical and health humanities, there are a number of them. So BMJ Medical Humanities has a podcast. There's an Art of Medicine podcast. OUP has the Practical Medical Humanities podcast. Durham University in England has a podcast. Graphic Medicine does a regular podcast. This is just a small sample. There are many out there. And again, a podcast is listening. It's not reading anymore. It's not engaging with the text visually. And podcasts are only increasing in popularity and the number out them. So in the fall, you had a graphic medicine. You looked at comics right here in this room. And this is huge, and it is growing massively. Right? So the graphic medicine manifesto came out. There are more and more books, graphic books being written by patients, by family members of patients, by care providers as a way to express themselves. And what comics do is they interestingly combine the words and the pictures. And dabbling in this now, it really does change the way you think about concepts. So sometimes I think about the comic before I write the blog. Like, what would the image that represents this topic I'm interested in? And these are incredibly popular. In fact, MK's Taking Turns just won a large award because people are really finding these engaging. More and more patient education is happening through the use of comics rather than sort of word-packed, little pamphlets packed full of words. They're using comics. I was involved with a pharmaceutical company that actually created sort of a diagram of how to use their product instead of giving people long lists of instructions. We also have the digital humanities. So as Carrie said in my introduction, I'm involved with Studio Chai, Chicago, Chai, the X here, which is our digital humanities studio, and these are becoming very, very popular. So they're being used in lots of different ways, and the idea is here it's digital transformations of scholarly practice and dissemination within the humanities, opportunities for interdisciplinary collaborations and innovative teaching using digital tools and methods, creative and experimental uses of technology for scholarly communications, and critical study of computational media and digital culture globally. That's the Duke Digital Humanities Project, definition of what's going on. So I've really been fascinated by what I've been seeing here and what I've experienced using with Studio Chai. In many cases, what would normally take many, many pages of textual description can now be shown visually. From mapping changing neighborhoods and their inhabitants over time. So a colleague of mine at Rice University was looking at public spaces over time and had a map. You could slide the year and see where public gathering for different communities changed throughout the decades. Examining the spread of disease in a community. There was an exhibit in a museum in Chicago looking at tuberculosis and its spread as populations moved in a very dynamic looking map. There was one of the presentations we had was a person who was recording satellite sounds and then turned them into art by making his own paper to make small speakers. And then he took the speakers from the cards, you know, when you get the birthday cards that sing to you, you can take those speakers, and he played the sounds of the satellites, orchestrated, there were like 100 of them, into this art thing so you could experience what a satellite seemed like. You can create computer art. I actually draw all my comics on my tablet. And many more ways of understanding. It is a new way of interacting with information that's not text-based. At the same time, though, this has led me to question, in light of other trends, are we moving further down the road of this post-text future? This poster right here in the corner is from the University of Toronto, which is showcasing image-based storytelling, also known as visual narratives. You know, telling stories has traditionally been a text or an oral tradition, but now we're moving to doing it digitally. So this is another trend going on. Okay. So what does this mean for the health humanities? In part, that's what we are talking about today, and that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow, and hopefully have this collaborative paper on. What do all these trends mean for us? Digital humanities. Okay, so if you look, this looks like a map, but it's actually, how do we get from medical humanities, which was sort of this, you know, dual city with bioethics, to being this health humanities new thing on the, and the different roads we can take to get there. We have a rare opportunity in the academy to chart our own course, to map our own future, to move from becoming a field to perhaps a discipline someday. It takes work to define ourselves, from creating core curriculums, to developing research methods, from building majors and masters, from cuneiform tablets to a post-text preprint server future. The future of pedagogy and publishing in the health humanities is whatever we want it to be. Our companion field, bioethics, evolved in different ways through individuals and centers pursuing competing dreams. Some critics argue that at some point bioethics was taken over by the very bureaucrats it was born to criticize, that it lost control over itself. We could choose to follow a similar path and hope that universities give us space and that we kind of, you know, deal with what is thrown our way. We'll see what evolves, right? Or we can be more deliberate in creating ourselves through collaboration and strategic planning. I think that's in part what this gathering is about. The future of pedagogy and publishing in the health humanities is whatever we want it to be. This means we are only limited by our imagination, but we are also obligated to choose our path, or like bioethics, it may be chosen for us. We can soar, or we, like the medical humanities, we can be absorbed. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig.
Thanks.
So we have 20 minutes, 25 minutes for conversation. Question?
I have a question. Okay, for the last decade or so, I've been doing exactly what you're doing, a trend analyst, and not only technology, but some social trends and some wild cards. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of confused. So there's technology that affects the publishing industry, and there's also technology trends that would affect medical humanities. And those are two different topics. Do you actually get into what affects medical humanities?
Can you say more about that difference for me?
Well, like artificial intelligence, genomics. So how does that affect inclusiveness?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Denmark, they look at happiness, right? That's one of their indicators. And Finland, they have another one that's similarly related that they're coming out with. I mean, this is a conversation. It doesn't have to be me. I'm not an expert in this. So anybody, please feel free to jump in. I don't know the answer.
So I'm trying to figure out how all of my knowledge would fit into this theme.
Yeah, I think we've got a day to explore, right? Sorry, I don't have an answer for you. Yeah, Deborah.
I have a question about what you see as the impetus for the explosion of all this activity. I feel as though the humanities, everyone is unconsciously trying to follow the money, and yet it's not clear that really, relates to anything concrete, and I just would be interested.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple different angles to look at this. I think, as you brought up, from the perspective of the college student and the medical student, it's the parent. And the parent sees health or medical, and they're like, okay, there's money there, you'll have a career, you'll be fine. Little do they know. So, one of the things that I've written about is that this attracts people because it is related to something that they feel they can do that gets a job. It's a very applied field, right? So they see it that way. And I think it's like it's like we're giving them candy. Sure, it's medical humanities, eat the candy and then we'll get you into the humanities broader. That's my hope there. So I think that's going on. This growth in the undergraduate market is amazing. And you're going to talk a lot more about that tomorrow, right? And so there's a lot of trends coming out there. And partly it's because medical schools have relaxed a little bit in terms of letting in people who don't have biology majors. In fact, if you go to the AAMC website, the most people applying to medical school, the largest major, it's like over 10,000, is biology. But if you look at percent of success getting in, biology is actually one of the lowest. Physics and statistics are the highest. That's the most successful group, followed by the humanities, second. So I think people are seeing that. And I think we are the technology has sped up life, right? So there's a lot of studies out now that we're damaging our brains with all these little devices and screens we're staring at all the time, and the constant bells and whistles. Our attention span has shrunk. Anybody who's been in a classroom knows what I'm talking about. And so the humanities is a way to sort of re-engage ourselves and to sort of slow down and think deeply. So I think there's an attraction to that, even though it would seem counterintuitive, but I think a lot of students are enjoying that idea that they can kind of sit in a space and really concentrate on one thing. So I think it's a combination of different factors. I don't know, what do you think?
Anyone else want to chime in? I mean, I think these are great thoughts, but it does worry me that on some level, as we approach this idealistically, we're not thinking enough about what it really suggests about the biomedicalization of our imagination, including our imagination of education.
Possibly a practical question. As you sort of look at your map image that you had on the last slide, can you imagine possibly some sort of withdrawal from bioethics, or some sort of withdrawal, that might be too strong a word, from the instrumental use of health humanities and medical school as a way of, as you say, using art to understand how to take a good physical exam? As you sort of withdraw in those ways, how do you maintain some ability to impact the education and practical clinical care that's being delivered?
So I spent 5 years in a medical school teaching, and I had what I call the 20% rule. So 10% of your students think what you're doing is worthless and not worth their time, and you're just taking them away from the real work of science. 80% of students think, it's there, okay, fine. And then you have 10% students who think you are the most amazing thing on the planet. So 20% of students have the severe reaction. Why do 90% basically don't care for it or don't really care one way or the other? It's not on the board exams, right? And this is a group of people who are trained to take tests. And there's some bioethics questions on the test, a few. There's nothing about humanities on there. The AAMC says you should have something, but they don't say it should be substantial. They don't say anything more than that. And there's no penalty if you don't have it. We don't bring in much money. I mean, even in bioethics, most of the positions now aren't somebody with a PhD in philosophy to come teach bioethics. It's a physician who can also teach it, right? Somebody who can generate their own income, their own salary. And so I think there's some very practical reasons. And bioethics, is sort of, it's required in the hospitals. You don't have a lot of poets floating around hospitals these days, you know, that they should have, that the Joint Commission is saying everybody needs to have a poet walking around. So I think there's a lot of pressures for bioethics to be there. And the humanities hasn't worked, probably we just haven't worked with the AAMC in the same way. And I know Tess Jones was about 6 months ago, or last summer, she was meeting with Michael Blackie. They went to meet with the AAMC. And we're told, yes, we want more humanities, and then turn around and nothing happened. So, but for the students to kind of grasp it, we have to learn to speak their language, which is multiple choice test exams, which is sad. And that's my experience. So I left the medical school because I was frustrated by students, the vast majority who didn't really care about this. I talked to our graduates and I was like, and they were like, yeah, that was okay. I'm like, but you were there and you were taking the literature and medicine course and you absolutely loved it. I'm like, yeah, I figured it would look good on my residency application. They're very pragmatic about it. And that might be what we have to do, but if we're sitting here visioning, I'd like to vision something bigger.
I think I come from anthropology, and in our experience, there's also a big kind of audience for publications, but also a big interest among people who work in medicine and see the limits of what they're doing. So it's not just unique education, but it's society at large in a way, or people who've been in hospital and felt what happened. And so I think for publishing, that broader audience is also interesting to keep in mind. And you are engaging with that audience through your blogs, etc. So the broader audience is also, I think, where the multimedia comes in and can reach them. But I'm also intrigued because in the Netherlands, anthropology falls under social science, and medical anthropology is a social science. And we also have health humanities. And in medical anthropology, there's actually two big chunks of work. One is more applied, and the other is much more critical. So the critical medical anthropology maybe is even more dominant by now. And that kind of, the publications are mostly critique, I think, of medicine, which of course has a consequence for how it relates to medicine. But, and it sounds like I would have expected health humanities, history, and philosophy to also have more of that.
So there are definitely critical streams within the health humanities, and that's being reflected in the chapters in our book. I mean, you're writing a disabilities chapter, right? Disability and aging. And in American anthropology, there's also sort of the CMA side and then the non-CMA side. Actually, the reason that I got a PhD in medical humanities is I was in the PhD for medical anthropology. I'd done my master's and then went to do the master's in bioethics. So I did this simultaneously. And when I went back to do my PhD in anthropology, they said, well, that was nice. But essentially, I was next in line to get a full tuition waiver, and they skipped me over sort of as punishment for having gone outside the field. Today, now they're like kicking themselves because everybody wants to do this. But there was definitely the sense that, well, that stuff is all about judging people. We're anthropology, we don't judge. And so, you can't go do that. And I was like, all right, well, I obviously can't do what I want to do here. Now, that was 20 years ago, so things have hopefully changed. But there are still today in this world, there aren't a ton of people in the social sciences involved with it. And in the medical schools, bioethics and the humanities pushed out a lot of the social science. So right there. In the back, you've been patient.
I'm an internist, and every internist of my generation, at least, would read Harrison's textbook of internal medicine. And it's translated into 17 languages and 2 versions of Chinese. I mean, you probably go anywhere in the world with a book, and the local physicians will know what it is. This textbook has now become unreadable because it is filled with medical acronyms from multidisciplinary fields. And if you do, the Department of Defense has developed a readability index, and you can take 3,000 words or 5,000 words and put it in, and you find out that it's off the scale. Because I'm working on one annotation. So there's, in medicine today, you no longer feel like a physician that's dealing with human beings. You feel like a nanotechnologist that has to give a medicine for a specific receptor. And when you look at the medical literature, for instance, if you look at Nature or Science, or there's much more graphics to explain many of these things. And but the escape of the young doctors is they use these kinds of tools that are on iPhones, and they get a lot of their instantaneous medical knowledge by reading something at the bedside and putting some formula in or some list. And I think the electronic medical records do that. And I think that, I had a physician talk with a physician at UNC who gave medical grand rounds, and I talked about the fact that he dealt with a particular subject, so it's such a compendium. He says, and I talked about Harrison's, and he referred to it as Moogle, like a medical Google, which has a list of all the things you're supposed to know. But you need something in terms of vocabulary and language. And then you find out that the specialists, the radiologist, the infectious disease doctor, the internist, the family practitioner, will have totally different terminology for the same thing that they're seeing. And those problems have to be solved because you're getting a fundamental alienation of young doctors. And I think that's a practical aspect of something that would make Harrison's readable, right?
Yeah. One of my colleagues in Texas actually published a book on, it was the Picture Atlas of Family Medicine. And so, yeah, so he photographed, and he's a great photographer, and he got consent from all his patients. But it's, these beautiful pictures of all these diseases and conditions for the practitioner on their own who, so I think for, very much talking about what you are. Interesting.
Okay, I wanted to follow up. You asked for a specific example.
Yeah.
Okay, so you discussed drones delivering medicine.
Yes.
Okay, so what I did in the past, I studied like the S-curve of drones, with the actual technology itself, the infrastructure, and the regulations, and developed several scenarios. So you would have in management consulting, you would have a client. So if the client was someone in medical humanities, so you mentioned empathy was one factor. So this could affect jobs. So some people in the medical field are going to keep their jobs because they had empathy rather than AI. So, like on this particular example, like when you teach, I have a framework, like a checklist of things I look at. So how do you deal with something like that?
As far as teaching about technology?
Well, yeah, I mean, like, you're talking about the future, so how does this fit into the future of medical humanities?
I think that's what we're here to talk about. I mean, I didn't even mention AIs, but I think
drones, you just assume it's AI because there is AI.
I don't have an answer. I think we're here to talk about what that feature could look like and what would be involved.
Well, I have a question about, the development of the field. And again, I'm a publisher who is not in this exact field, but I publish bioethics, and just how, and I just don't know. Even though I publish a lot in bioethics and textbooks in bioethics, what happened in that field that got the curriculum going, got courses going, was that, I mean, it was probably a panoply of things that happened, but was it, at some point it became required of medical school? I mean, what is the thing that made it happen? And my guess is that it became increasingly required of the students and nursing programs and things like that to allow the field to grow and have fill courses.
So it's not in nursing schools. Nursing schools have ethics lectures, but there's very few nursing schools that have a full ethics class. And I haven't done the survey yet, but I'm thinking of doing it, looking at the humanities.
They do have a bioethics course, but it's
right.
But it's spotty. It's spotty.
Yeah, it's not a requirement. It's like they have it because they think should have it. So if you look at like the history of bioethics, it's sort of in the early 1970s, late 1960s. There were a lot of trends, but you have the formation of these centers that had money behind them. So the Kennedy Center had the Kennedy Monday, Georgetown. Hastings Center didn't have money at first, but they got very, very good at working with the media to try and get people to have money. You had physicians who thought this stuff was great. And they had powerful posts in their medical schools, and they were able to get that happening. And then as they rose through the ranks, they also got onto things like the AAMC and at the AMA and sort of could get it put into the curriculum. Not as much as they'd like. So another trend that happened was the Academy for Professionalism in Healthcare developed about 8-9 years ago. And this was a result to how to get more bioethics into residency programs, which did not necessarily have a requirement for it, but it's got these 6 areas that you have to focus on, and professionalism is one of them, and they figured that's the best way we could get in there. So it's sort of in medical schools, and there were physician advocates in schools that have big programs. There were physician advocates who rose through the ranks, became deans, and really got it in there.
And tried to get to add a course or part of a course or
right.
some kind of clinical course.
So where I taught in San Antonio, Abraham Verghese, writer Cutting for Stone, he and My Own Country, he was brought in by the dean to sort of start something, a narrative program. And he created a course with Tess Jones, and they created a course in the first, and it was like 8 weeks in the first year and 8 weeks in the last year, sort of blanketing it. But when they left and I came in, there was a new dean. The move was towards bioethics because the students needed that for their examinations. And so the humanities stuff became electives and not as well supported. It moved out of the required curriculum into the elective, and that's a lot of what's going on. I mean, when I did my survey, so many of the comments were, we used to have so much more. We're hoping we can have more. We've been subsumed under clinical ethics, which they distinguish from philosophical ethics, which they saw as humanities, but clinical ethics being the very applied stuff that's taught. So bioethics is the big dog. And we're a little chihuahua that has kind of gotten pushed to the side.
I have a somewhat broad-based question for you, but I'm curious where you see the conversations that have gone on the past few years about structural competency, if you see that intersecting at all with what you're laying out here.
I'm not sure. Can you say more about the structural competency?
Jonathan Netzel and Helena Hansen have been publishing on structural competency as helping us to move away from cultural competencies, right? So it's not that physicians in training should be learning about different cultures, but they should be learning about the structural effects on people's health, which is really the driving factor in things like health inequalities. Right. So I'm just curious, right, because they've been publishing more around changing institutionally protocols within medical education, and so I'm just curious how you see that connecting to Health Humanities and like what we're doing here over the next year.
So I just finished, because our finals ended on Monday, a course, the capstone course in our Bioethics Society major, and so it's really sort of the anthropology of bioethics we were looking at. And so the capstone course was critical studies of bioethics, right? And so we looked at disability critiques and feminist critiques and LGBTQIA critiques and philosophical critiques and religious critiques, but basically like all these different ways of looking at what this thing is called bioethics. And the students found it so wide opening because it's so rare in a discipline that you kind of question, what is this discipline? Why does it exist? What should it be? And it was fascinating to them. So That's been my experience with that area, but I've been I haven't been near medicine in about 5 years. Well, besides my clinical ethics work, so I don't know. I haven't seen a lot there, but there might be somebody here who knows way more than I do, which would not be hard.
I'll chime in. Oh, you first, please.
Okay, cool. So I just like to talk about the medical education part. The program amid the Masters of Biomedical Science. The goal of the program is to prepare, because most of us in this program want to do medical school or some sort of health profession afterwards. And we do have a lot of focus on sort of humanities. It's under one of the classes called EHPPD. And I think the importance of this because we realize that, so a big topic that's right now that's talked about in a lot of medical fields is social determinants of health, because we realize that at some point, like, the best procedures, the most advanced medical techniques can only get so far for patient's recovery. There's still a large portion of the patient's health status that's determined by just where they live, their environment, their sort of emotional well-being. So you can't really understand those things with just by a biomolecular assay or a lab test. So I think being able to, and you might see this, us again in the future in more medical schools, they focus back on health humanities because people realizing if you understand how people, like just understand your patients and the way they feel about diseases, the very complexity of the human nature itself, you'll end up being a better physician. And I would say that that's the pragmatic way to approach people to get their foot in the door into why they're interested in health humanities.
That's exactly the reason that I left the medical school. Because I realized by the time people get to med school, they're attuned to, they've already been trained for what they need to have, like what's on the tests and what counts. And I realized undergraduate students, they were so open to things because they're not like, okay, what do I need to know to pass the board exam? It was, what do I need to know to even think about being, the concept of being a doctor? And so people are much, much more open to it. And I think the way we do this work is with the undergraduates. So, Deborah, you were speaking.
Sure, I was just going to say in relation to Olivia's question that it seems to me that the structural competency model, although it's a terrible name and nobody understands it at first, is really incredibly harmonious with anthropology, African American studies, women's studies, gender studies, with critique as it exists in the humanities. At the same time, it requires sort of global health or population health methodology that people don't learn in the humanities. And so it seems like a unique opportunity, but one that is hard to fully take advantage of. But it's something that we all need to know about in medical humanities because it does allow us to do that kind of deep social critique within it. That's, I don't know.
So we're at time, so I want to invite everyone back tomorrow morning. We'll have breakfast at 9, and then we'll start panels, Aaron's talk at 9:30. And thanks to Craig for starting us off so